Another year, another COP, another round of contention. This time, funding is the key. As fierce debates take place in Sharm el-Sheikh, we invite people in the know to go beyond the emotional narratives and try to focus on realistic solutions. COP27, a world insight.
And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today we are focusing on COP27, the ongoing international conference on climate change. Another year, another UN climate summit, and another round of fierce debates, this year in particular on the question of how to split the bill to pay for future solutions and pass the damages. Before we loop in our panelists, let's take a look at what has been happening in Sharm el-Sheikh.
A year of extreme weather ahead of COP27. Crippling heat waves, devastating floods, lives lost, homes destroyed, food insecurity worsened, natural disasters at a scale and severity unseen in decades, which are likely to become more common as the world's climate continues to warm. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif came to the host city of Sharm el-Sheikh to seek funding to help his country recover.
To not let helplessness become a death sentence.
Climate vulnerable and developing nations have demanded for so-called loss and damage compensation from rich nations for decades, and this year's delegates finally agreed to officially discuss the topic.
This creates, for the first time, an institutionally stable space on the formal agenda of the COP and the Paris Agreement to discuss the pressing issue of funding arrangements needed to deal with existing gaps in responding to loss and damage.
Yet richer countries are failing to meet existing funding goals. At COP15 in 2009, developed nations pledged to transfer $100 billion each year to developing nations by 2020 to help with climate adaptation and mitigation. In 2020, that number fell short and reached about $83 billion. Representatives from nearly 200 countries have until next Friday to make progress in the world's collective climate response, which the United Nations Secretary General has described as on a highway to climate hell.
In Sharm el-Sheikh, Jackson Owen, who is a senior fellow with the Nicholas Institute for Energy and Environment Sustainability with Duke Kunshan University. In Islamabad, Mohammad Irfan Khan, professor and founder of the Department of Environmental Science from the International Islamic University. In Groningen, Klaus Hubashek, who is a professor in ecological economics at Energy and Sustainability Research Institute in Groningen with the University of Groningen. In Beijing, Ma Jun, director of the Institute for Public and Environmental Affairs and founder of the Blue Map Act. Now, the ongoing discussions at COP27, the majority of it has to do with funding. So, what about funding? Xie Zhenhua, China's special envoy on climate change, he talked about the developed countries promised $100 billion to developing countries. Now it's far from being fulfilled. This has been a promise made for years. What about that?
This issue has haven't been resolved for 13 years. It has been agreed in COP meeting in Copenhagen, 2009, that compensation funds should be made. Compensation should be made to the vulnerable and least developed countries. Having said that, this issue have never been fully fulfilled. Some of the funding have been provided, but it has not reached the 100 billion target. And in the meantime, some of the funding they're not really in the form of grant, but more like just loans, probably with more favorable interest rate, and then some of them are reallocated from other development funds.
So that's different
why,
from the earlier promises, right? It's not about money moving from here to there, and therefore it becomes 100 billion.
The rich countries have been falling short. We learned from Professor Stern, for example, that the required investments are up to $2 trillion. So 100 billion is a small amount in comparison. So enormous funds are needed, and indeed should be forthcoming. There's really not any excuse, and you're right. It has been since the Cancun meeting and Copenhagen earlier, where the idea was developed, and it is 13 or 14 years and nothing much has happened.
Yeah. Mr. Irwin, Professor, I know you are in COP27. So what happened to that? Is there any promises or real concrete actions coming from developed countries at the meeting right now about this?
As of last year, the funding under the 100 billion reached just over $80 billion by most calculations. That is, as the other speakers and as Special Envoy Xie Jinhua have mentioned, is a real shortcoming, and the developed countries have justifiably been criticized and continue to be criticized for that shortfall. It remains to be seen whether the collective contributions of all of the developed countries will exceed $100 billion, which is the per annum requirement under Copenhagen this year. I don't think that outcome is likely to be clarified at this COP.
If that is the case, Professor Khan, is there any other relevant promises being made at this year's COP, relevant at all? One could just make empty promises, so-called promise washing, and be able to not fulfill them anytime and continue to add on with new promises. Professor Khan.
In fact, you're starting from Copenhagen, but if I remember from 1992, the Rio Summit, and then 97, the New York Summit, and then 2002, the Johannesburg, and then Copenhagen and the Paris Accord and everything. And I think it's remained the promises unfulfilled. One of the things is mechanism. Coming to the point, like the Paris Agreement, it is the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that deals with the carbon trading and emissions, these kind of things. The mechanisms are so cumbersome, and the United Nations Environment Program, they have started its inception phase in July this year, just 3 months back. And this is still in the inception phase, and it will go till next 5 years probably. So by that time, maybe not the Sharm el-Sheikh will go somewhere else. So that will remain like the program. The capacity building in the developing countries, how to tap those funds. That remained missing, and for that reasons, there are certain countries, they promise to give funding for the capacity building of the governments and the institutions in developing countries, so they will be able to utilize the fund, tap the fund, what are the procedures and how to involve a third party in between. So that's one of the reasons. Instead of one promise, the other things, how to get benefit out of this promise. So in that, many developing nations, they remained under capacity and they could not understand the mechanism of financing.
So there are actually a whole rainbow of issues, even related to this promise made by Copenhagen, and you argue even earlier. Not only the funding itself, but also how the funding will be used, whether there's consensus and agreement, and whether there's capabilities of using these funding with sufficient talents and ways. So all of these are details that need to be worked out, not to mention the amount of money that has been long promised. Professor Khan, do I understand you right?
Exactly, absolutely.
Okay.
We are 80% there to reach the 100 billion. So great efforts have been made indeed, but it's still a significant shortfall, and it just has to be, the gap has to be closed as quickly as possible. And as mentioned just by the speaker before, all these other mechanisms have to be in place. There has to be third-party verifications. There has to be an agreement. Definitions are even missing as mentioned earlier, in terms, is it a loan, is it a grant, and so on and so forth. So many open questions.
Are those open questions, Mr. Irwin, being worked on right now in detail at the COP27?
Yes, certainly those questions are on the table for negotiations, but it's important also to note that many of these material decisions will be made not through political processes at COP, but through the financial decisions of major asset managers, fund managers, holders of capital and pension funds, managers of capital and banks, et cetera. And they need to be incentivized not only by the international agreements reached at COP, such as Article 6, which was referenced a moment ago, but also through different financial incentive structures that are being worked on here at the initiative of countries themselves. Ultimately, it will be the decision of the investors where they invest their money. And COP is in part an effort to collectivize and aggregate the volumes of capital that are flowing towards the clean energy and climate change adaptation sectors where they're needed.
There are a number of very important development banks around the world. For example, Asia Development Bank, European Development Bank. There's also Reconstruction Bank as well. Meanwhile, in Asia, for example, there's AIIB, the largest, one could argue, investment bank in this part of the world. But many argue their amount of funding and also their capabilities is only a small proportion of what the world needs. Now, what does that mean for these development banks? What roles are they going to play? I see many of them at this year's COP27.
Right. The volumes of capital invested by those banks is marginal compared to groups like the China Development Bank, the China Exim Bank, and a number of private banks from developed Western countries. So as a result of that reality, the development banks need to invest in areas of projects that de-risk them, that can catalyze private sector funding, so they can come in and guarantee different sorts of structures that will make emerging markets where risks are perceived as high for currency or political or natural hazard reasons, and allow the private sector banks to come in on the heels of that investment in a way that is more palatable to them risk-wise.
The other thing I want to touch on when it comes to funding, Professor Khan, particularly to you, is about the loss and damages. That has been on the agenda for this year's COP27. Professor Khan, from your perspective, especially a group of 77, the developing countries in which Pakistan is part of it, how do you see these kinds of debates taking place at COP27?
Looking at the population of India and China, and now include Pakistan too also, we're almost half the world. So ultimately, there are many things which are related to consumers. And where there are more consumers, they cannot compromise on the consumer needs. Instead of anything that you are emitting pollution or emitting what you call carbon dioxide or any other thing, that is relevant to the number of people utilizing those technologies. And now already the developing economies, they are having 3 times more impact than the developed economies. Those, in fact, are the emitters, the more emitters. But instead of the use of technology in these countries where the population is not that much high, even it's higher than those where is a big population. So in that case, I think that should be considered in terms of the numbers, where a number of inhabitants, the number of human beings living in that part of the world, they are the effectees and they should be the beneficiary also. So these kind of things, I think they have to evolve certain mechanisms to compensate in a proportionate share compared to what you have, your economy, what you have, the number of people in the country, and what kind of developing, because once the developed world has developed, they've achieved it. The developing economies, they are in the process of developing. So they'll keep on increasing. So the containment for them will be a compromise on their development. So that has to be considered in all these discussions.
Very important points. Professor Hubershek.
Yeah, that is a very interesting point, but it's still the case that the developing countries are also tend to be the most vulnerable ones. And so it is also in their interest to really do something about climate change. And development does not necessarily mean to burn more and more coal. So there has to be a move away from fossil fuels towards renewables. So now where the transfer of technologies and money comes in is that the rich countries need then to help the developing countries to move on a zero emission path, right? So not to prevent or preclude development, but enable development with the growth of renewables and clean technologies. I think that's an important aspect.
Without the question being resolved, or at least attempting to be resolved, as we discussed earlier about the funding, the second one, the loss and damages, will be very hard to resolve. Mr. Ma, please, your point.
This is the first time for this issue, for the financing to address loss and damage to be put into the formal agenda. Before, the focus is more first on mitigation, meaning to the reduction of carbon emission, and then on adaptation, meaning adapt to the change of the climate. But we need to recognize that some of the human induced climate change may not be able to be mitigated or adapted at this moment. So that's the issue of loss and damage. It can include those extreme weather events that we have witnessed, with the extreme heat wave and historic drought in the Yangtze River Valley this year, and really the very, very severe flooding in Pakistan. But it also can include those slow issues such as the sea level rise and rising temperature, desertification, glacier retreat, and all of this. So this issue is really making a big impact on some of the least developed and vulnerable, countries. So besides the mitigation and adaptation, which are very, very important, many argue there should be a third pillar of to address the loss and damage.
Developing countries are both the victims of others' emission. Let's just say historically developed economies, what they did since the Industrial Revolution, but also the victims of their own emissions as well, likely in the future at least, because the emissions right now might not have a direct impact yet, and yet in the future it would. So how do you see this very entangling struggle that the developing countries are having right now, making sure also the other two guests the points about these developing countries also need to have development. So how are they going to solve this problem at this moment?
Yes, we're talking about historical cumulative emission that is having an impact on the least developed and the most vulnerable, and so this is about the fair and just climate action. I think this is about the fairness, and that's why we need to make compensation to them, because they contributed so little and suffered so much. Unfortunately, the small island country, they contributed very, very little, and African countries like barely 4% of the global total. Yeah. So that's first, it's about that, and then it's about green transition. They also need their green development, their low carbon transition, and they need support for that. And and if we don't provide that support, not just those countries will suffer, but the whole world is going to suffer from that. So that's why more money needs to be more funding needs to be raised to support them. And obviously, $100 billion is far from being enough to address that. So that's why private capital also may have to be involved.
Professor Irwin.
I agree with all of Professor Ma's points. I will only add that low carbon development and investments that drive it are not in tension with improving the lives of people in developing countries. Rather, the outcomes here can be a win for development and a win for the environment. It's just difficult. In some cases, like those of India or Pakistan or China, there's already a strong industrial base in many parts of the country. Much of that is driven by coal, and so there will need to be a transition away from coal in countries such as those and in places like Indonesia and Vietnam. In other countries, there is not a strong industrial or energy base already, and so there it's the case of needing to build new energy infrastructure and to not go to the energy systems of the past, but rather look to those of the future.
What role will business really play in an environment that is actually quite unpredictable? And yet, when you think about sustainable development, that is really the light at the end of the tunnel everybody's looking at. So this predictability and unpredictability. Professor Irwin, what are you hearing?
Well, the role of business in the COP processes has been increasing for many years, and it's inescapable to recognize that it's not governments that are going to be producing the food and products that citizens purchase and need and want for their human development. It's businesses. It's, as we mentioned earlier, not development banks that hold the majority of the capital. It's not country-level development finance institutions either. It's private banks. And in some cases, state-owned banks that operate in a private sector manner. And so ultimately, it's up to the political apparatus, both at domestic levels within countries and through the COP processes internationally, to set incentives, to set rules, to set standards, to set mechanisms for accountability, and to give some predictability to these private sector organizations and financiers that can send the signal that these clean energy and low carbon spaces are areas that can be profitable for them.
One of the experiments we have been doing, Professor Hubashek, is carbon trading. Now you also see not only in Europe, but also even in China, some of the carbon trading centers being established in Guangzhou and some of the other places in China. So how is, the experiments going on within countries and also between regions going to provide us with more inspiration for the business role and also the green financing issue?
Yeah, carbon trading is not an entirely new thing. It's within the larger family of putting a price on polluting substances and carbon in this case, so carbon taxes, for example. And so what we do need is indeed, and that links to the discussion before, to provide clear incentives for businesses to do the right thing. So investing in carbon and fossil fuel infrastructure has to be less profitable than investing in renewables. And carbon trading experiments, carbon pricing more widely helps to provide those right incentives. Of course, politically speaking, it's quite difficult at the current moment with the cost of living crisis to increase prices even further through carbon pricing. But in fact, that is needed. But then the revenues are available to be redistributed towards clean technologies, towards renewables, and towards the most vulnerable developing countries, but also the most vulnerable within the rich countries. There's huge inequalities between rich and poor, also in rich countries. And so those vulnerables across the world need to be protected. And carbon pricing, either through carbon trading mechanisms or carbon taxation, would allow you to achieve those additional funds.
Mr. Ma, China is already experimenting with it with some carbon trading centers in different parts of the country. Now, how much do you see that is bringing the momentum about how the business community can participate and the right mechanism, market mechanism should be established to encourage those right participation?
Yes, carbon trade is very important market-based mechanism to but it's mostly means to reduce the greenhouse gas emission in a more efficient way, in a least costly way. I mean, that's the purpose of the carbon-free carbon market. China has built our carbon market, and we hope that it can gradually mature and function to help with the global, fighting against climate change by mitigate the emission.
Professor Khan, your thoughts on that too? The involvement of business community and whether that's going to solve the problem?
I think, in my opinion, no. Because you see, we are talking about mitigation measures and adaptation measures, and this is one thing very clear, that adaptation cannot replace the mitigations. We are talking about reducing the carbon emission, and on the other side, when you are giving it a business touch with the emission trading, with the carbon emission trading, so that gives a motivation to the businessman. So the more carbon, they can more trade in these things. One thing, when we talk about with the perspective of climate justice, because those who has the money, they can trade off the carbons, and at the expense of the calamities and the miseries in the developing economies. So if they can trade off this the carbon emissions, so in that case the carbon emission become like another trading component, and the suffering due to the climate change in the developing economies, in the poor countries, they will remain over there. It is just shifting from here to here, and if you have the money, you can buy anything. So in that case, you are allowed to generate carbon, but you pay off. The carbon will remain in the atmosphere, and that is going to impact the climate, and the climate change will definitely going to impact those who are living at the vulnerable economies, like in mostly developing countries.
I want to thank all of you for your precious time in participating in this discussion. I hope all of these discussions eventually would lead to results and actions. Thank you so much, Jackson Irwin in COP27 for us, and Mohammed Irfan Khan, Klaus Huberschek, Ma Jun. Thank you. And that's our special discussion on the ongoing COP27, its challenges, and hopefully its road to solutions. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now.